The forest line did not move. It stood as a wall of tangled bark and shadow, indifferent to the man standing at its edge. Mark gripped the single dry seed in his palm, his knuckles white against the rough husk. He looked down at his hands. They were mapped with calluses and tremors that would not stop, a physical record of months spent wrestling with timber and stone. Behind him lay the clearing, a graveyard of half-formed frames and rotting beams. Every structure he had attempted had surrendered to the wind, leaving nothing but splintered debris and wasted days. The air smelled of damp earth and coming rain, a scent that usually promised growth but now only signaled another collapse. He shifted his weight, his boots sinking into the mud, and looked back toward the dark tree line. The forest waited. He squeezed the seed until it bit into his skin, his breath hitching in the cold air. He had nothing left to build with, yet he was still standing there, waiting for a signal that refused to come. The silence of the clearing was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic pulse of his own exhaustion. A low whistle cut through the trees, rising in pitch until it became a roar. Mark turned to the frame he had spent the last 3 days erecting. He grabbed a heavy timber, desperate to lash the support beam into place before the gust hit. The wind hammered the structure, shaking the wood until it groaned. He braced his shoulder against the upright, muscles locking as he fought the pressure. He felt the frame sway. It tipped, then lurched. The lashing snapped. The sound of wood shearing against wood was sharp and final. The entire wall folded, collapsing into a heap of jagged splinters and twisted nails. Mark stepped back as the debris settled in the mud. He watched the last beam roll into the dirt, coming to rest near his boots. The wind died down as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the clearing in a sudden, ringing silence. He did not move to pick up the pieces. He only stared at the wreckage, his chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged bursts. The cycle was complete. Another day, another collapse. Nothing remained but the broken pile of his own effort, scattered across the damp earth. Mark did not leave the pile of rubble. He knelt in the wet soil, his fingers digging into the mud, and gripped the heavy, splintered beam. He needed to clear the path. He heaved, his back arching, his teeth gritted against the strain. The wood was waterlogged and heavier than it had been an hour ago. He lifted it 6 inches off the ground, his arms shaking violently, the strain radiating from his shoulders down to his core. Then, his grip failed. The beam slammed back into the dirt with a dull, wet thud that vibrated through his knees. He stayed there, head hanging, lungs burning as he gasped for air. He did not hear her approach. He only felt the shift in the air, a sudden stillness that forced him to look up. Standing 10 paces away, beyond the edge of the debris, was a figure. She stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the broken frame. She did not offer a hand to help him up. She did not speak. She simply watched the splinters, her eyes tracking the jagged lines of his failure. The silence between them was not empty. It was heavy, expectant, and entirely focused on the wreckage at his feet. Elena took a single step forward, her eyes never leaving the pile of wood. She pointed a finger at the jagged, uneven joints where the frame had sheared apart. "What did the wood tell you today?" she asked. Her voice was steady, cutting through the damp air of the clearing. Mark stood up, his legs trembling from the long hours of labor. He wiped a streak of mud and sweat from his forehead, his knuckles still raw from the splinters. He wanted to blame the wind, or the uneven ground, or the quality of the timber, but the sight of the collapsed structure silenced his excuses. He looked at the splintered joints, the wood fibers frayed and distorted where he had forced them together. He followed her gaze, tracing the lines of his own mistakes. "The angles," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. He knelt back down, pointing specifically to the corner where the load-bearing beam had snapped. The angles were wrong. They could not support the weight. He did not look up, waiting for her reaction. He felt the heat rising in his face, a mixture of shame and the raw reality of his technical inadequacy. He had focused on the speed of the build rather than the physics of the connection. Now, with the frame in ruins, the geometry of his error was impossible to ignore. Elena did not offer comfort. She looked at the wreckage one last time, then reached into her pack. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound volume, its edges softened by years of friction and damp. She held it out. Mark hesitated, his hands still caked in dirt, before he reached out to take it. The book was heavy, denser than it looked. "Success isn't about avoiding the fall," Elena said, her tone devoid of pity. "It is about documenting the gravity that caused it." She flipped the cover open, revealing pages crowded with technical diagrams, crosshatched sketches, and dense, handwritten notes documenting structural collapses identical to his own. It was a ledger of every mistake she had made over the last 20 years. Mark stared at the ink. He saw his own errors mapped out in her past. The shame he had felt moments ago began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp curiosity. He ran a thumb over a sketch of a failed joint, tracing the exact angle where her structure had once buckled. The notebook was not a trophy of her expertise. It was a roadmap of her resilience. He gripped the spine, feeling the texture of the worn material, and understood that he was no longer looking at an insurmountable disaster, but a technical problem waiting to be solved. He looked up at Elena, but she had already turned, leaving him alone with the weight of her history in his hands. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest in a deep, stagnant gray. Mark retreated to the center of his broken frame, lit a single oil lamp, and opened the notebook. The smell of old paper and dried ink filled the air. He laid his own rough, unfinished sketches beside Elena's precise blueprints. He spent hours tracing the lines, comparing his impulsive structural guesses against her meticulous corrections. Each page revealed a version of his own struggle, the snapped beams, the shifting foundations, the wasted effort. He realized then that his isolation had been his greatest anchor. He had been laboring in a vacuum, pretending he was the first person to encounter these laws of physics, while the answers sat in a shelf he had never bothered to open. The realization was physical. His chest tightened as he saw how much time he had burned in his pride. He flipped through the pages until dawn, his eyes burning from the lantern light. He wasn't just learning architecture. He was unlearning the habit of doing things alone. The silence of the forest no longer felt like a challenge, but like a wasted opportunity. By the time the first light of morning touched the rafters, he had stopped trying to reinvent the wheel. He closed the book, stood up, and looked at the path leading away from the trees. He knew what he had to do. Mark walked away from the forest edge, the notebook tucked firmly under his arm. The valley path was busy now, filled with the sounds of saws and hammers echoing from the distance. He reached the center of the village where the guild hall stood. It was a massive, timber-framed structure, its doors thrown open to the morning air. Sounds of debate and heavy labor spilled out into the street. Mark stopped at the threshold. His heart thudded against his ribs. He felt the familiar pull of the forest, the urge to retreat to his own space where no one could watch him fail. He looked at his hands, calloused and stained with wood resin. He gripped the notebook tighter. He took a breath, stepped over the threshold, and crossed the threshold into the noise. The atmosphere inside was thick with the scent of sawdust and heated debate. Conversations cut off as he entered, but he did not pull back. He walked to the center of the floor, past the rows of master builders, and stood before the main workbench. He planted his feet, looked at the nearest builder, and opened the notebook to the first page. He was done pretending. He was here to learn. The master builder looked at Mark, then at the notebook, and finally at the raw piece of timber Mark held out. Mark pointed to the joint he had been struggling with for weeks. "Why does it split when the load shifts?" he asked. The room went quiet. It was a question a novice should have known. A few builders nearby turned, eyes narrowing, but the master simply took the wood. He placed it on the anvil, tapped it once with a heavy iron hammer to demonstrate the grain's stress point, and sighed. "You are fighting the wood instead of reading it," the man replied. He took a chisel and shaved a sliver off the edge, showing Mark how the grain actually wanted to sit. Mark watched the wood fall away, his pulse quickening as the logic clicked into place. He felt the heat rise in his face from the embarrassment, but he ignored it. He scribbled the technique into his notebook, his hand moving faster than his mind could process. Another question followed, then another. Every time he felt the sting of sounding foolish, he pushed through, trading his pride for a piece of tangible knowledge. The room stopped being a place of judgment and became a map of solutions. He wasn't just asking questions anymore. He was building a foundation of facts. Mark caught himself mid-sentence, about to defend a failed structural theory he had clung to for months. He stopped, his mouth still open, and looked at the builder across from him. This was the moment his old self would have argued, insisting on his own flawed logic to save face. Instead, he closed his mouth, nodded, and waited for the correction. The builder pointed to the blueprint error and explained the physics of weight distribution. Mark listened, really listened, without the filter of his own ego. He realized that trying to look like an expert had been a cage, preventing him from ever actually becoming one. He set his pen down and asked the builder to explain the process from the ground up, starting with the simplest beam. When a younger apprentice made a suggestion that challenged his own recent notes, Mark didn't bristle. He grabbed a piece of charcoal and sketched the alternative, comparing the two methods side by side on the workbench. He watched the lines intersect, testing the strength of the new idea against his own. The discomfort of being the least informed person in the room vanished, replaced by the hunger for the next piece of the puzzle. He stopped measuring his worth by what he already knew and started measuring it by what he could absorb. The structure of his own arrogance had finally collapsed, and for the first time he was ready to build something that would last. Mark returned to his plot, the silence of the forest no longer feeling like a judgment, but like an empty canvas. He did not rush to hammer nails. He knelt by the dirt, cleared the debris, and leveled the earth with a wooden spade. His movements were slow, measured, and stripped of the frantic energy that had defined his previous attempts. When he laid the first perimeter stake, he checked the alignment against his notes 3 times. He found a slight variance in the soil, a slope he had overlooked for months. Instead of cursing the ground, he dug deeper, shifting the earth until the base sat perfectly flat. He hauled the heavy foundation beams into place, testing the weight before letting them settle into the trenches. Every action was intentional. He set the corner joint, checked the angle with a plumb line, and held his breath as he tapped it into position. The wood groaned, but it did not split. He stepped back, wiping the grit from his palms, and surveyed the frame. It was not a house yet, but for the first time, the ground beneath him felt solid. He picked up the mallet, aligned his next measurement with the edge of the beam, and began the work of building upwards, one deliberate strike at a time. Mark drove the final wedge into the vertical frame, the sound echoing sharply against the stillness of the valley. He wiped his palms on his trousers and stepped back to inspect the uprights. The structure stood plumb, a skeleton of timber waiting for the bracing to lock it into permanence. As he reached for the next beam, the light shifted. The bright, high noon glare vanished, replaced by a bruised, metallic haze that bled across the horizon. Mark stopped. He looked up, watching the canopy of the forest go unnaturally still. The birds had ceased their calls. A sudden sharp drop in temperature prickled the skin on his arms. He grabbed his level, sensing the change in pressure before the first sound arrived. It began as a low, mournful whistle through the high branches, a distant warning that gained volume with every passing second. Leaves began to whip violently against the ground, and a fine spray of grit skittered across the floorboards. Mark braced his feet, his hands gripping the side of the frame as the air pressure shifted again. A powerful, sudden gust slammed into the side of the building, making the timber groan under the unexpected load. The frame shuddered, held for a heartbeat, and settled. The storm had arrived. The wind did not just blow, it shoved. The structure groaned, a deep, wooden complaint that vibrated through the floorboards and up into Mark's boots. A sudden, violent gust caught the upper bracing, causing the frame to shudder. One of the vertical supports rattled against its foundation, the sound sharp and discordant. Mark lunged forward, pressing his shoulder against the timber to stop the vibration. He felt the force of the air pushing back, relentless and heavy. He adjusted his stance, locking his knees and distributing his weight to brace the joint. The wood creaked again, but the movement was tighter, more controlled. He gripped the upright, his knuckles white, watching the joints for any sign of splitting. The air was thick with flying debris, leaves and twigs slapping against the skeletal walls. He stayed low, maintaining the pressure, refusing to let the frame yield. He recalled the sensation of his previous walls collapsing, the way they had buckled and folded in similar conditions. He compared that memory to the solid, unmoving resistance he felt beneath his hands now. The structure was holding. He shifted his grip, bracing for the next harder surge of wind, and did not move. The sky opened. A deluge of water slammed into the ridge, turning the air into a chaotic blur of gray. Rain hammered the timber, splashing off the beams and pooling instantly on the floor. The wind intensified, tearing through the open rafters with a high-pitched scream that swallowed all other sound. Mark ducked as a loose section of protective tarp tore free, flapping wildly before it was ripped into the darkness. He reached out to grab a secondary support, but the force of the gale pushed him back, sliding his boots across the slick wood. Water cascaded down his face, blinding him, yet he kept his eyes locked on the primary load-bearing joints. Every time the frame took a hit, the structure flexed. It was a violent, rhythmic swaying that threatened to pull the nails from the grain. He grabbed a heavy mallet from his belt, moving along the perimeter to hammer in a loose bracing plate. The rain soaked through everything. His muscles burned from the sustained effort of resisting the pressure. He stood in the center of the chaos, legs planted wide, watching the water pour through the overhead gaps. The storm was testing every single connection he had made. The pressure spiked. A wall of wind slammed against the windward side, a force that should have folded the timber into splinters. Mark braced his back against the central pillar, waiting for the familiar groan of failing wood. It did not come. The frame groaned, but it was a solid, deep sound of resistance rather than the high-pitched shriek of snapping fasteners. He looked up, tracking the movement of the rafters. They swayed inches, then snapped back into place with absolute precision. The joints, measured and set with the techniques he had learned, held the tension. He watched the crossbeams. They remained perfectly flush, the grain of the wood absorbing the vibration without shifting a millimeter. The gale roared, trying to find a weak point, whistling through the gaps in the rafters as if searching for a way to break the seal. Mark pushed his palm against the main support. It was steady. It was immovable. The storm continued to thrash against the exterior, throwing water and debris against the walls, but the interior remained a pocket of controlled stability. He shifted his weight, no longer fighting to save the structure, but watching it perform the work he had built it to do. For the first time, the house was stronger than the wind. Mark stood motionless as the wind continued its assault. He looked at the floorboards beneath his feet, then back toward the corner where his first attempt had buckled months ago. A sharp image flashed in his mind. The pile of splintered beams, the dust rising as his walls turned to debris, and the stinging frustration of that day. He had once seen those moments as absolute defeats. He had viewed them as evidence of his own incompetence. Now, standing in the center of a storm that should have leveled his work, he saw the truth. Each collapse had been a lesson in physics he could not have learned from a book. Every snapped joint was a piece of information he had filed away, a form of tuition paid in sweat and splintered wood. He reached out and touched a primary support beam. It was firm, grounded, and perfectly aligned because he had finally learned to respect the forces he was working against. The failure was not a tragedy. It was the necessary architecture of his current stability. He was no longer reacting to the wind. He was understanding the gravity that had caused his earlier falls. The internal noise of his self-doubt finally quieted, replaced by the steady, rhythmic pulse of a structure that refused to yield. The storm outside began to lose its rhythm, turning into a steady, rhythmic rain. Mark stepped toward the threshold of his new shelter. He reached into his pocket and felt the hard, dry surface of the seed he had carried since the beginning. He knelt on the floorboards, cleared away a patch of loose soil and wood shavings near the foundation, and pressed his fingers into the damp, dark earth. It felt cool and yielding. He dropped the seed into the small depression he had made. He covered it, pressing the soil down with his palm until it was firm and level. This was the final piece of the build. He looked at the walls that had defied the gale, and then back at the spot where the seed now rested. The house was not just a collection of timber and nails anymore. It was an environment. He realized he had spent months trying to force a result, but he was actually growing a life. The stability of the frame was merely the soil. His actions were the roots. He stood up, his knees dusted with earth, and looked out through the doorway. The rain continued to fall, but the ground beneath his feet was no longer a place of failure. It was a place of origin. The fear that once constricted his chest had evaporated, leaving only the clarity of the task at hand. Mark turned away from the threshold, his gaze sweeping the frame with the precision of a master builder. He reached into his belt and pulled out his hammer. The weight of the tool felt natural in his grip, no longer a heavy burden of expectation, but an extension of his own resolve. He walked to a beam near the rafters that still needed a final, decisive strike. He did not rush. He did not worry about whether the wood would splinter or the structure would groan under the pressure. He measured the distance with his eye, adjusted his stance, and raised the hammer. Every movement was deliberate, stripped of the frantic energy that had defined his earlier, failing attempts. He was no longer reacting to the instability of the world. He was asserting his own order upon it. He brought the hammer down. The sound of steel hitting metal echoed through the frame, a sharp, singular note of finality. He struck again, once, twice, ensuring the joint was locked, sealed, and immovable. He stood back, breathing evenly, his hand resting against the solid timber. The work was no longer a question of survival, but a testament of capability. He had stopped waiting for the perfect outcome and began crafting it with every swing. The echo of the final blow died away, leaving only the sound of dripping water from the eaves. Mark stood perfectly still, his hand lingering against the wood. Above, the heavy, bruised clouds began to thin. A thin line of light appeared at the horizon, widening as the storm retreated. It moved across the valley floor like a slow-rising tide, turning the dark, sodden earth into a deep, rich brown. As the light reached the clearing, it caught the frame of the house. The structure glowed. Every joint he had meticulously measured, every beam he had set with intent, stood illuminated in the sharp, morning clarity. There was no shaking, no swaying. The wind had ceased its assault, leaving behind a silence that felt like validation. He watched the light creep higher, tracing the lines of the rafters until the entire frame was bathed in warmth. The water droplets clinging to the timber caught the sun, sparkling like glass. He looked up at the sky, watching the blue expand, pushing back the last remnants of the gray. The morning air felt sharp and clean in his lungs. He had spent weeks fighting the elements, but now, the elements were merely the backdrop to his success. The structure was no longer just a shelter against the world. It was a visible manifestation of his own stability. Mark walked the length of the main support beam, his palm tracing the grain of the wood. The structure felt solid, grounded, and entirely his own. He stopped at the very last joint, the one that had eluded him during his first failed attempts. He did not rush this final connection. He took a single, heavy nail from his pouch and set it against the timber. He paused, his hand hovering, feeling the weight of all the lessons he had collected over these past months. This was not just about holding two pieces of wood together. It was about the culmination of every error, every adjustment, and every moment of doubt that he had finally overcome. He raised the hammer. He struck once to set the nail, the sound ringing out with a clean, metallic clarity that sliced through the morning air. He struck again, harder, driving the steel deep into the heart of the wood. With a third, final blow, the nail had vanished into the beam, flush and secure. He did not pull his hand away immediately. He let his knuckles rest against the timber, feeling the vibration of the strike fade into the stillness of the morning. The work was finished. The transition was complete. He stood there, alone in the clearing, no longer looking for the next problem to solve, but simply existing within the space he had created. Mark stepped back, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The structure did not shudder. It stood as a permanent feature of the landscape. He took a long breath, the air smelling of wet pine and turned soil. The fear that had once paralyzed his hands was gone, replaced by the quiet certainty of experience. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the single dry seed. He walked to the threshold, knelt, and pressed the seed into the dark, rich ground. This was the next step. Not a final destination, but a new beginning. He stood up, wiping his palms on his legs, and looked at the horizon. The valley was no longer a place of confusion, but a map of lessons learned. Every failure he had endured was now a structural support in his character. He watched the light move across the rafters one last time. The house was solid. His resolve was firm. He had stopped waiting for the perfect day to begin his life, and had instead built the foundation for it with his own hands. He turned away from the frame and looked toward the trees, ready for the work that would follow. He was no longer a man searching for a way forward. He was the man who had built the path himself.